The boarding party was supposed to take the ship in under 4 minutes. That was the standard. 4 minutes from the moment boots hit the deck until every hostile was neutralized and the vessel was declared secure. The American team had trained for this specific scenario for months. They had rehearsed on mock-up ships until every movement was automatic. They had the latest tactical equipment, night vision systems that cost more than most cars, communications gear that linked every operator in real time, breaching tools engineered to defeat any hatch or door they might encounter. When they launched from their rigid-hull inflatable boat toward the target vessel during this bilateral exercise with the Royal Navy, they expected to demonstrate American maritime dominance. What happened in the next 7 minutes would become one of the most discussed training failures in modern naval special operations. The American team did not secure the ship in 4 minutes. They did not secure it in 7 minutes. They never secured it at all. The Royal Marines boarding team that followed them completed the identical scenario in 2 minutes and 43 seconds. The gap between American expectation and British execution was so stark that American officers demanded the exercise be repeated. Certain that some error had corrupted the first attempt, the repeat produced identical results. What the Royal Navy did in those few minutes left American commanders with instant regret and uncomfortable questions about why the most expensive navy in the world had just been humiliated in one of maritime warfare's most fundamental operations. Let me explain what shipboarding actually involves, because understanding the complexity illuminates why the outcome was so shocking. Maritime interdiction, specifically visit board search and seizure operations, known as VBSS in military terminology, represents one of the most dangerous and demanding missions any naval force can execute. You are approaching a vessel that may contain hostile personnel. You are transitioning from small boat to target ship, a moment of extreme vulnerability. You are entering confined spaces where every corner could conceal threat. You are operating in a three-dimensional environment where danger exists above, below, and on every side. The margin for error is measured in fractions of seconds. Hesitation kills. Mistakes kill. Even perfect execution can produce casualties if fortune turns against you. The skills required for effective boarding operations span multiple domains. Physical conditioning to climb ladders and move through ships while carrying combat loads. Tactical proficiency in close-quarters combat, where engagements happen at arm's length. Explosive and mechanical breaching to defeat secured hatches. Coordination so precise that multiple elements can clear simultaneously without fratricide. Speed that overwhelms defender response time. Violence of action that paralyzes resistance before it can organize. The combination of these demands makes shipboarding among the most challenging operations any military unit can attempt. The exercise that produced such shocking results was conducted in waters off the British coast as part of a bilateral training program. Designed to enhance interoperability between American and British naval forces, the participants represented elite maritime capability from both nations. The American team was drawn from Navy SEAL operators assigned to VBSS duties and sailors from the Navy's specialized boarding teams. The British team consisted of Royal Marines from the Fleet Protection Group, the unit specifically tasked with maritime interdiction and shipboarding operations. Both forces were considered among the best in the world at this mission set. Both arrived confident in their capabilities. Only one would leave with that confidence intact. The target vessel was a decommissioned ship configured to simulate a hostile merchant vessel. Role players aboard would represent armed resistance. Monitoring systems would track every movement, every shot, every second of the operation. The scoring criteria were precise. It's time to secure all spaces, accuracy of fire against hostile targets, avoidance of civilian role player casualties, coordination between team elements. Every dimension of boarding proficiency would be measured and compared. The American team launched first. Their approach to the target vessel was professional and well executed. The transition from small boat to ship went smoothly. They gained the deck without incident, and then the problems began. If you are finding this analysis valuable and want to understand what truly separates naval special operations capabilities, subscribe right now. Next week, I am covering why certain NATO forces maintain maritime standards that others consider impossible to achieve. But right now, let me tell you exactly what happened when the American team began clearing the target vessel, because the breakdown that followed shocked everyone observing. The American boarding doctrine emphasizes systematic clearance. Teams move through the vessel space by space, securing each area before proceeding to the next. This approach prioritizes safety and thoroughness. No space is left uncleared. No threat is bypassed. The progression is methodical and controlled. This doctrine has merit, reduces the risk of threats emerging behind the boarding team. It ensures comprehensive coverage of the vessel. It is taught throughout American military boarding training. The problem is that methodical clearance takes time. Time in boarding operations is not neutral. Time allows defenders to organize. Time allows resistance to coordinate. Time allows ambush positions to be prepared. Time transforms what should be overwhelming assault into attritional combat where the boarding team loses its initiative advantage. The American team began their clearance with textbook execution of their doctrine. They moved from the deck into the superstructure, clearing each compartment before proceeding to the next. Their movements were professional. Their technique was sound by American standards, but observer timing showed they were moving at approximately one-third the pace required to achieve the 4-minute standard. At the 2-minute mark, when the ship should have been nearly secured, the American team had cleared approximately 20% of the target spaces. Role-player hostiles who had not yet been engaged were repositioning throughout the vessel. The element of surprise that the boarding team should have exploited was dissipating with every passing second. At the 4-minute mark, when the exercise should have concluded with American success, the American team was engaged in prolonged clearance of the engineering spaces. They had suffered 2 simulated casualties from role-player ambushes. Their momentum had stalled. The systematic approach that was supposed to ensure safety had created the conditions for defender advantage. The exercise controllers allowed the American attempt to continue beyond the standard time to document complete performance. At the 7-minute mark, the American team had still not secured all spaces. Simulated casualties had increased to 4. The decision was made to terminate the attempt and record a failure to complete within any reasonable standard. The American team leader was visibly frustrated during the immediate after-action discussion. His team had executed their doctrine correctly. Every procedure had been followed. Every technique had been applied as trained. And they had failed comprehensively. The failure was not in execution. The failure was in the doctrine itself. The Royal Marines launched their attempt approximately 1 hour later. After the target vessel had been reset and role players repositioned, what followed redefined what the American observers thought was possible. The Royal Marine approach to shipboarding reflects a fundamentally different philosophy. Where American doctrine emphasizes systematic safety, British doctrine emphasizes overwhelming speed. Where American teams clear sequentially, British teams clear simultaneously. Where American boarding is methodical, British boarding is violent. The Royal Marines hit the deck and immediately split into multiple elements. Rather than proceeding space by space, they flowed into the vessel through multiple entry points simultaneously. The superstructure, the engineering spaces, the holds, all were being cleared at the same time by elements that had trained to operate independently while maintaining overall coordination. The speed was remarkable. British operators moved through compartments at rates that seemed to sacrifice safety for tempo, but the apparent sacrifice was an illusion. The speed itself was the safety measure. By moving faster than defenders could react, by clearing faster than ambushes could be prepared, the Royal Marines denied the enemy the time advantage that methodical clearance grants. At the 1-minute mark, the Royal Marines had cleared more than half the target spaces. Role-player hostiles were being neutralized before they could coordinate response. The boarding team maintained initiative throughout the operation. There was no pause. There was no hesitation. There was only relentless forward momentum that overwhelmed everything in its path. At 2 minutes and 43 seconds, the exercise was concluded. All spaces secured, all hostiles neutralized. 0 civilian casualties. 0 boarding team casualties. The Royal Marines had executed in under 3 minutes what the American team could not accomplish in 7. The immediate American reaction combined shock with disbelief. Officers demanded confirmation that both teams had faced identical scenarios. Officers asked whether the role-player resistance had differed. It had not. Officers questioned whether some advantage had been given to the British team. None had. The exercise had been scrupulously fair. The results were simply what they were. Let me explain the specific differences that produce this outcome, because understanding the mechanism reveals why the gap was so large. The first difference was training volume for boarding operations. Royal Marines and the Fleet Protection Group conduct shipboarding training as their primary mission focus. They board ships constantly, training exercises, operational boardings, repetitions that number in the hundreds for experienced operators. This volume produces automatic responses that require no conscious thought. Every movement has been performed so many times that the body executes while the mind focuses on tactical assessment. American VBSS teams train for boarding as one mission among several. Their overall training is excellent, but the specific volume of boarding repetitions is typically lower than British equivalents. Movements that should be automatic may still require conscious direction. This small additional cognitive load accumulates across an operation and manifests as reduced speed. The second difference was simultaneous versus sequential clearance doctrine. The British approach requires multiple elements to operate independently while maintaining awareness of each other's positions. This is difficult to coordinate. It requires extensive training specifically for this mode of operation. But it produces clearance at multiples of the speed sequential methods can achieve. The American sequential approach is easier to coordinate. It reduces fratricide risk by ensuring elements always know where friendly forces are. But this safety margin comes at the cost of speed that the British are willing to sacrifice the margin to obtain. The third difference was the cultural attitude toward acceptable risk. British boarding doctrine accepts risk levels that American doctrine considers excessive. British operators move faster because they are trained to accept the danger that speed creates. American operators move slower because they are trained to minimize danger through control and coordination. Neither approach is wrong in absolute terms. Both reflect rational decisions about risk and reward.
Ow!
But in a timed competition where speed is the primary measure, the force that accepts more risk will move faster and win. The fourth difference was small boat-to-ship transition methods. British boarding techniques include approach and climbing methods developed specifically for speed. The pole and climbing systems, the ladder techniques, the transition drills have all been optimized for minimum time between boat and deck. American methods are effective, but have not been equally optimized for pure speed. The fifth difference was equipment philosophy. British boarding equipment tends toward simplicity and reliability. Fewer electronic systems mean fewer potential failure points. The focus is on fundamental tools that work every time. American equipment includes more sophisticated systems that provide advantages when working but add complexity that can slow operations when problems occur. These 5 differences combine to produce the gap the exercise demonstrated. No single factor explains British superiority. The combination does. Every dimension of the boarding operation where British training and doctrine differed from American equivalents favored speed. The accumulated effect was performance that American methods could not approach. The Afteraction analysis extended over several days and produced conclusions that American naval leadership found uncomfortable but ultimately accepted. The first conclusion was that American VBSS doctrine required fundamental reconsideration. The methodical approach that had been standard for decades was producing results that could not compete with Allied performance. Either the doctrine had to change, or American forces would remain inferior in this mission set. The second conclusion was that training volume for boarding operations needed to increase. American operators were well trained in general terms, but had not achieved the automatic proficiency that British operators demonstrated. More repetitions were needed to close this gap. The third conclusion was that risk acceptance in training needed examination. American training culture emphasizes safety in ways that may prevent development of capabilities that require operating closer to acceptable risk boundaries. The British willingness to accept training risk produced operators comfortable with operational risk. American training caution produced operators less comfortable at the edge. The fourth conclusion was that coordination of simultaneous clearance required specific development. American doctrine had not prepared teams for the independent yet coordinated operation that British teams demonstrated. This capability required training that American programs did not adequately provide. The fifth conclusion was perhaps most significant. The exercise demonstrated that Allied forces are not interchangeable. British boarding capability exceeded American boarding capability for this specific mission type. Combined operations that assumed equivalent capability would produce plans that did not reflect actual performance differentials. Let me share perspectives from participants because individual accounts illuminate what aggregate analysis cannot capture. A U.S. Navy SEAL petty officer who participated in the American attempt described his experience with unusual candor. He said the British made them look like amateurs, and he did not use that word lightly. His team had trained for this. They had prepared specifically for this exercise. He had expected to perform well. Instead, they watched the British do in under 3 minutes what they could not do in 7. He continued by describing his observation of the British attempt. He said their movement was unlike anything he had seen in American training. They flowed through the ship like water. There was no hesitation. There was no deliberation. They simply moved and cleared, and moved again at a pace that seemed impossible until you watched it happen. His assessment was that American doctrine was the limiting factor. His teammates were physically capable. Their marksmanship was excellent. Their courage was not in question. But they were executing a doctrine that was slower by design. The doctrine was the problem. Change the doctrine, and American teams could achieve similar results. A Royal Marines corporal who participated in the British attempt offered perspective from the successful side. He described the exercise as routine. Nothing about the scenario had surprised him. The target vessel was similar to ships he had boarded many times in training. The role-player resistance was typical. His team had done exactly what they always did. The result was what they expected. He noted that speed was not something his team consciously pursued. It emerged from training that made every movement automatic. When you have boarded hundreds of ships, you do not think about what to do next. You simply do it. The speed comes from the absence of deliberation rather than from rushing. His observation of the American attempt was professional rather than critical. He said the Americans were clearly competent operators who were executing a different doctrine. Their methods were not wrong. They were different. In this exercise, the difference produced inferior results. In other contexts, their methods might have advantages he could not see. A U.S. Navy commander who observed the exercise offered strategic perspective. She acknowledged that the results were not what American leadership had hoped to see. The gap between American and British performance was significant enough to require a response rather than explanation. Her assessment was that the exercise had revealed a training gap that comfortable assumptions had concealed. American naval leadership had assumed that American VBSS capability was among the best in the world. The exercise demonstrated that British capability exceeded American capability by a substantial margin. This information was uncomfortable, but valuable. Better to learn it in exercise than in operations where the stakes would be real. She recommended that American training programs incorporate lessons from British methods. The specific techniques that produced British speed could be studied and adapted. Exchange programs could expose American operators to British training approaches. The gap could be closed through deliberate effort if leadership prioritized this mission set. A Royal Navy officer who helped design the exercise offered perspective on what the results demonstrated about broader training philosophies. He noted that British maritime boarding doctrine had been developed through decades of operational experience. Northern Ireland, maritime security operations, counter-narcotics in the Caribbean, counter-piracy off Somalia, anti-smuggling throughout British waters. This operational experience had refined British methods through continuous real-world feedback. American VBSS doctrine had developed along a different path. More emphasis on training and simulation, less sustained operational boarding experience across diverse scenarios. The doctrinal differences reflected these different development histories. British doctrine evolved from operations. American doctrine evolved from training programs. The exercise measured outcomes of these different development processes. The response to this exercise has influenced American naval training in subsequent years. The specific changes implemented remain partly internal to naval training commands. What can be observed is increased emphasis on boarding operations in some programs, expanded exchange opportunities with British and other allied forces, and doctrinal review that continues to examine how American methods compare with allied best practices. Whether these changes have closed the gap demonstrated in this exercise is difficult to assess without access to subsequent comparative data. What can be said is that The exercise produced learning that would not have occurred through comfortable training that never tested. American methods against Allied standards. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Next week, I am covering why certain naval special operations forces maintain standards that others consider impossible to achieve. The week after that, I am examining a maritime scenario where American methods proved superior to Allied approaches because capability differences exist in multiple directions. Drop your comments below. Tell me about your own experiences with maritime operations if you have served. Tell me whether you believe speed or methodical safety produces better boarding outcomes. These perspectives matter because this debate continues in professional naval circles. If you learned something from this video, share it with someone who appreciates understanding how naval forces actually operate. Not the movie version where boarding parties always succeed dramatically, but the real version where training and doctrine determine outcomes in ways that can be measured and compared. The instant regret the American team experienced was not about individual failure. The operators who participated were capable professionals who executed their training correctly. The regret was institutional. It was the recognition that their doctrine, their training system, their methods had produced capability inferior to what British approaches produced. This is valuable regret. Regret that produces examination, produces improvement. The American naval community did not dismiss the exercise results or make excuses. They studied what the British had done differently. They examined their own methods with critical honesty. They initiated changes designed to close the gap the exercise had revealed. The Royal Navy did not celebrate the exercise as a victory over Allies. British officers shared their methods openly. They explained their doctrine. They offered training opportunities for American operators to experience British approaches firsthand. This is how professional allies operate. Competition in training produces information. Confirmation produces improvement. Improvement benefits the alliance. The shipboarding exercise that produced instant American regret also produced lasting American improvement. The regret was temporary. The learning was permanent. British methods that had taken decades to develop through operational experience were suddenly available for study and adaptation. The exercise compressed learning that might otherwise have taken years into immediate revelation. This is what joint training is designed to accomplish. It's not comfortable exercises where everyone succeeds and no one learns anything. Challenging exercises where differences in capability become visible and available for analysis. The exercise succeeded precisely because it produced the shocking result that forced examination. Until next time, remember that capability gaps between allies are features of joint training rather than bugs. The gaps reveal what needs attention. The revelation enables response. The response produces improvement. The American team that lost this exercise returned home with knowledge that would make future American teams better. The loss produced more value than a comfortable win would have produced. 2 minutes and 43 seconds versus 7 minutes and incomplete? The numbers do not lie. The British approach to shipboarding produced results that American approaches could not match under identical conditions. This was not about individual operators. This was about systems and doctrines and training philosophies that produced different capabilities. The American operators who experienced instant regret were experiencing the gap between a system and a different system that had optimized more effectively for this specific challenge. Their regret was justified because the gap was real, a response to the regret seeking to understand and adapt rather than dismiss and excuse. Demonstrated the professionalism that characterizes American special operations. Both nations are better prepared for combined maritime operations because this exercise occurred. The British demonstrated what was possible. The Americans learned what they needed to develop. The alliance gained shared understanding that enables effective planning based on actual capabilities rather than assumptions. The shipboarding exercise produced instant regret. The regret produced learning. The learning produces improvement that continues long after the exercise concluded. That is the purpose of demanding joint training. That is why the Royal Navy's demonstration of superior boarding capabilities served American interests, even though it embarrassed American participants in the moment. 7 minutes of American struggle, 2 minutes and 43 seconds of British dominance. The gap was real. The response to the gap determines what happens next. American naval training has responded with the seriousness the gap deserved. Whether the responses closed the gap remains to be measured. What is certain is that the instant regret produced lasting attention to a capability that might otherwise have been assumed rather than developed. The Royal Navy's shipboarding excellence is not natural. It is trained. It reflects decades of doctrinal development and operational refinement. Any navy willing to make equivalent investment could produce equivalent capability. The British advantage is earned through sustained commitment to this mission set. The American response demonstrates recognition that equivalent commitment is required to achieve equivalent results. The exercise that shocked everyone served everyone. Shock produces attention. Attention produces change. Change produces capability. The instant regret was the beginning of improvement that continues to this day.